It's October 2023. Finnish and Estonian engineers are panicked and confused. The undersea gas pipeline between both nations is showing a major drop in pressure. They checked their instruments. They're working fine. The pipeline is critical for both nations, and they scramble to identify the cause of this freak accident. Except this wasn't an accident. With every piece of information that bubbled to the surface, it became clear that this was an act of sabotage. A Chinese cargo ship had accidentally dragged its anchor for hundreds of kilometers along the ocean floor, tearing a hole in the pipeline and uprooting vital undersea communication cables. They may not have known it, but in that moment, both Estonia and Finland had been plunged into a new kind of warfare. In ancient times, warfare meant groups of people fighting each other with sharp sticks. You could see your opponent, rudimentary battle tactics applied, and generally the more people and sticks you had, the better your chances. In the 21st century, however, conflicts have evolved far past these limitations. Now warfare can be anywhere, at any time, and through any means. War is no longer solely soldier versus soldier. It calls on new strategies. And one of these strategies is energy warfare. This is a style of conflict that can turn every vehicle in your army into a monumentally expensive paperweight. It can starve your domestic population without a shot being fired, and it can grease palms just as well as it can the barrel of a gun.
Today's sponsor, Raycon, make incredible earbuds. These are the everyday earbuds, and they make a fantastic gift, whether that's for someone else or just for yourself. They're affordable, they're comfortable, and yes, they've got active noise cancellation, which is a kind of a small miracle at the price point these things are sold for. Plus, they've got all sorts of fantastic colors. I've got a case on mine, actually, that they sent me separately, which I rather like. I'll just pop that off. You can see mine are black. I put a more interesting case on there just for fun. Plus, the battery's legit 32 hours with the case. Quick charge lets you get 90 minutes of listen time in just 10 minutes of charging. There's multi-point pairing too, so you can swap from your phone to your iPad without you having to fuss around with the Bluetooth settings, which no one enjoys doing. So look, try Raycon today, whether you're walking, editing, zoning out while pretending to clean. Raycon will be there for you. So go to buyraycon.com/warfronts and get 20% off site-wide. That's buyraycon.com/warfronts, brought to you by Raycon. And now back to today's episode.
2014, ISIS seizes Syrian oil fields. 2022, Russia cuts Europe off from oil and gas, hoping to freeze the continent due to its support for Ukraine. 2010, Qatar uses its vast natural gas wealth to secure a bid for the FIFA World Cup. What do all of these events have in common? Well, they showcase the diverse ways that energy warfare can be fought. There are three factors that drive energy warfare. The first is the scarcity of fossil fuels. The finite amount on Earth drives global demand. The second is every nation on Earth needs fossil fuels to function, with no exceptions. The third is the fact that not all countries are created equal in regard to resources. It's this imbalance that creates the gap where energy warfare exists. To use an example, if the fictional republic of Simon Stan has energy resources and the kingdom of Whistlerelia needs those resources, Simon Stan has the upper hand and can politically impose itself on its neighbor. Now, Simon Stan may simply wish to forge an economic partnership with Whistlerelia, but if the kingdom pursues an unfavorable foreign policy, the oil it gets from Simon Stan could dry up very, very quickly. In other words, Simon Stan's resources may well deter Whistlerelia from aspiring towards any policy it doesn't like if it knows that one wrong move could turn the lights off in the capital. Now, obviously, that's just a fictional example, but it does show how, in a world with ever-changing political allegiances, controlling natural resources is a very powerful tool. However, many nations are not willing to cooperate from a position of strength, leading to scenarios where countries increasingly attempt to coerce and blackmail each other through energy resources for their political gain. One step further up the ladder, there's the violent side of energy warfare. NATO defines this as a subsidiary of hybrid warfare, where the goal is to undermine or harm a target through overt and covert means. For energy, that means critical infrastructure being targeted through a variety of techniques. Adversaries may employ cyber attacks, conventional kinetic warfare, economic pressure, and more, all to politically or militarily harm other nations, even to the extent of exerting control over them. And what's the easiest resource with which to manipulate not just other nations, but the whole world? Well, there's a reason that we call it black gold.
Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it.
Oil is one of the most important substances on the planet. The stuff can hold up dictators' regimes for decades, or bring world superpowers halfway across the globe to knock on their door. It makes up a key component of fuels, plastics, and other vital products that nation-states need for everyday survival. Oil is so vital to the way the global economy functions that access to it and manipulation over it has caused many political crises. It is these crises over energy, and specifically oil, where the coercion and control arm of energy warfare becomes most prominent. One of the best-known examples is from World War II. Japan's seizure of Korea and the brutal campaign in China had raised alarm bells in Washington. When Japanese forces then moved into southern Indochina intent on taking British Malaya, the US felt forced to act. An oil embargo by the US aimed to curtail Japanese aggression, but instead led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. This pretty early example shows how energy coercion is used by nations to try and bring other nations under control. It also highlights the volatility with which a state may react to such attempts. The US's gambit, while paying a very high price, served as a lesson to other nations with similar ambitions. Less fanatical regimes than Imperial Japan may have chosen to come to the negotiation table if threatened with a similar cutoff. I mean, without oil, a nation, even back then, ground to a halt pretty fast. The US is not the only country rich enough in resources to try energy coercion. In fact, some modern nations have been able to exploit US dependence on oil for their own gain. The biggest example of oil politics affecting the US was during the crisis following the Yom Kippur War. After Egypt and Syria attacked Israel in 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, a regional version of OPEC, pledged to embargo all nations supporting Israel. The US had just given Israel an emergency aid package worth over $2 billion, so you can probably guess what happened next. Gas prices in 1973 quadrupled to over $11 per gallon and remained high even after the embargo ended in 1974. It goes to show even a global hegemon can be affected by energy warfare. Today, of course, the US can count on its alliance with OPEC's biggest producer to stop a repeat of the 1970s oil crisis. Saudi Arabia, with the second highest global oil share behind Venezuela, makes a smart ally for Washington. However, the partnership also gives the Saudis some leverage over America. The US does deals with the Saudis for oil and gains an ally in the region. In return, Washington tacitly supports the Saudis with their regional realpolitik. The humanitarian disaster currently happening in Yemen is ongoing owing to a Saudi coalition-enforced blockade, which has led to untold levels of suffering. There are natural concerns that attempts to bring the Saudis in line over Yemen could lead them to cutting oil production, driving up global prices. One can't help think that if it weren't for the Saudis' oil wealth, they would not be able to convince the United States to look the other way. Saudi analyst Najjar al-Ataibi concurs, telling France 24 in 2022 that, quote, "The Ukrainian crisis has given Saudi Arabia more leverage to use its hard power assets, oil, and pressure some of the strongest countries, such as the United States." However, manipulating global oil prices is not something a state can do alone. The Saudis may have a huge global oil share, but their impact on prices is weakened without cooperation from other oil-producing states. What would happen if almost every oil-rich nation all decided to start cooperating in order to keep prices high? Well, you don't need to imagine it, because OPEC exists. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's an international group encompassing nations who are net exporters of oil. Current estimates suggest that 79% of oil reserves are concentrated in OPEC nations. Challenging the oil cartel is a dangerous game, as Moscow found out in 2020 when increased prevalence of US shale meant Saudi-led OPEC wanted to cut oil production to keep prices stable. Russia, which relies on fossil fuel exports economically, disagreed, believing cuts would effectively hand the US a larger market share. In the ensuing dispute, OPEC flooded the market with oil, and prices plummeted by 21% overnight. Moscow was proven right in the end, though. A 2023 Economist report stated that despite OPEC cutting production by 3.7 million barrels a day, other producers quickly made up the shortfall. I'm sure the moral victory was fairly bittersweet for the Kremlin. Yeah, for all the seeming power of OPEC. These sorts of shenanigans aren't simple to orchestrate. Coercion can fail. One of the most significant examples of this in the modern era revolves around Ukraine. When looking at Russian energy warfare around the Ukraine conflict, it appears President Putin's actions have actually led to the weakening of Russia's ability to conduct energy warfare. The Ukraine war also shows just how reliant Russian foreign policy was on this coercion. Oil, of course, is not the only energy resource, with Russia holding enormous swaths of global natural gas supplies. Supplies that until 2022, it sold all over the world, with the biggest buyer being Europe. Between Nord Stream 1, the Yamal pipeline, Blue Stream, and Turk Stream, Russia was shipping 175.5 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe a year in 2021. Pipelines accounting for 40 billion cubic meters of that ran through Ukraine. When Russia invaded in 2022, the Turk Stream pipeline extension and Nord Stream 2 were both under construction, showing they had plans for the sector to expand post-war. The Kremlin banked their invasion on Europe's Russian resource reliance, and that was a gamble that Russia lost. Rather than all be like, oh no, not our precious gas, please, do whatever you like to Ukraine, just keep the gas flowing. Europe decried the Kremlin's special military operation and worse still, started sending Ukraine resources, training their troops and collaborating against Russia more than ever. The Kremlin then stopped many of the pipelines to Europe, attempting to starve the Europeans of cheap oil and gas to heat their homes as winter set in. Russia's second gamble was the average European would not accept price rises to heat their homes, all for the sovereignty of Ukraine. Again, Europe rallied in defiance, even as inflation spiked and a cost of living crisis ensued. In a conventional conflict, it's popular belief that you cannot bomb a country into submission. As it turns out, you can't freeze them into submission either. The strangest part, Putin probably should have seen this coming. By 2022, the US shale gas revolution was well underway, and the United States had gone from being a bit player in the liquefied natural gas export market to one of its biggest behemoths. That meant Europe could turn to Washington, and to a lesser extent Norway, to plug the gaps in its supply. As someone who publicly opposed fracking in the 2010s, it's likely Putin knew of America's growing ability to support Europe. Fiona Hill, John Bolton's former staffer at the National Security Council and the White House's former top expert on Russia, told Forbes in 2019 that Putin, quote, saw American fracking as a great threat to Russian interests. The fact that Putin likely knew the US would leap to resupply the old continent serves to make Russia's decision to cut off its biggest energy customer even more baffling. You could even extend the use of coercive energy warfare to a form of soft power, with nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar going on global charm offensives and entering the sporting world using their vast resource wealth. Lest we forget Qatar's controversial but successful bid for the 2022 World Cup. This too allows countries to leverage their resources in return for a more sanitized global image and a seat at the Western allies' table. However, this might be extending the definition of energy warfare a bridge too far. After all, nations leveraging their resources for their own benefit isn't exclusive to energy warfare. That's just geopolitics. If we were to talk about every instance of that happening in this video, we would be here literally all day. So let's instead focus on something that is unequivocally energy warfare personified, and that is the targeting of one state's energy infrastructure by another. When Estonia and Finland suffered their pipeline rupture in 2023, they weren't the only ones being thrust into a new world of warfare. States across the globe are increasingly facing a rude awakening in just how vulnerable their energy grids really are. We've started to see an upward trend of often unprotected energy infrastructure being attacked and sabotaged. Politico reported in January of 2024 that German prosecutors launched a probe into an attempted sabotage of one of its liquefied natural gas pipelines in the north of the country. Iran had its pipelines targeted in February. In both cases, the perpetrators of the attacks remain unknown. This is something we're seeing increasingly. The more nations rely on this infrastructure, with one small issue potentially rendering a pipeline out of commission for weeks, if not longer. This is only made worse when it's undersea infrastructure, as the access to the damaged site and the operations to repair it are made even more complex. Europe was shaken on September the 26th, 2022, when the Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged after a series of explosions were reported off the Swedish coast. The Associated Press reported in 2023 that Swedish prosecutors found a state actor to be the most likely culprit, with further investigations revealing that Ukraine may have been the mystery saboteur. However, the case is far from closed, and this ambiguity over who attacked the pipeline makes it harder for states to hold bad actors to account. This is a feature of hybrid warfare that has bled over into energy warfare. If you can take down an adversary's energy grid, that's fantastic. To do so without being discovered, even better. If Ukraine does turn out to be the saboteur, it will show Kyiv is not naive to energy warfare, and this leads us into perhaps the most recognizable form of energy warfare currently going on today: Ukraine's targeting of Russian oil refineries. Russia needs the profits from oil revenues to fund its war and dampen the impact of sanctions. Crucially, it also needs the oil itself to refine into fuel for use in its military infrastructure, like tanks, trucks, ships, planes, and missiles, which need fuel to reach their target. Simply put, Russian fossil fuels are doing a lot of heavy lifting. Hurt Russian energy, and their military can't move, can't fire, and can't resupply. Everything grinds to a halt when the meter hits empty. That's real power, and Ukraine is trying to exploit it. Statista tells us that Russian oil refining capacity sat at around 6.8 million barrels per day in 2023. However, a Ukrainian campaign has been using missiles and drones to target Russian refinery infrastructure. Bloomberg placed Russian refinery capacity at 5.2 million barrels per day in April of 2024, meaning that Ukraine's campaign at one stage may have been costing Russia 1.5 million barrels of refinery capacity every day, a reduction of almost a quarter on 2023 levels. Since then, Reuters reports that Russia has increased its idle refinery capacity in order to bridge the gap and keep things flowing, but that likely stems from the increased operation of already running refineries, not the building of new ones. Bloomberg states that Russian refinery attacks cost the Kremlin $135 million in April alone, or in other words, the approximate cost of 4 Russian Su-57 jets. Hemorrhaging that much money in lost oil monthly will dramatically affect Russia's ability to expand its military, especially when bogged down and already losing entire divisions' worth of equipment on the regular in Ukraine. There are other examples of direct attacks on energy infrastructure in warfare. After all, starving your adversary of energy is an easy way to cripple a nation outright. Saudi Arabia has frequently seen attacks on its oil infrastructure from Iran, as well as from Shia-backed groups like the Houthis in Yemen. Attacks at Abqaiq, the world's largest oil processing facility, and the Coercive oil field briefly took down 50% of Saudi oil production in 2019. This amounted to 5% of global oil supply. The attack highlighted the vulnerability of global oil supply chains. In 2021, a Houthi drone attacked a Saudi Aramco facility, one of the largest oil ports in the world. Meanwhile, the continued attacks by Houthi forces in the Bab al-Mandeb Strait on global shipping also adds another threat to global energy supply routes, which by itself can drive up prices. There are countless other examples. ISIS targeted oil fields in Syria for capture, using them to enrich their terrorist organization, hence why the radical caliphate became so hard to dislodge. They had gained the resources they needed to sustain themselves through energy extraction. Similarly, during the First Gulf War, Saddam's forces burned the Kuwaiti oil fields as they retreated back to Iraq. The fires raged for 10 months, and immediately following the event, oil prices doubled to $40 per barrel before returning to normal. This is one of the reasons that the US targeted the capture of the oil infrastructure of Iraq first in 2003, as the same thing was attempted by Saddam's forces there. In the Kosovo War, NATO targeted Serbian electrical infrastructure and fuel depots, knocking out the grid and crippling Serbia's ability to maintain its military operations and communications. However, even direct kinetic attacks are not the only way to target energy infrastructure in the modern day. Cyber attacks can likewise be used to target infrastructure that is hard to reach through conventional means. Russia's cyber attacks on European energy infrastructure skyrocketed after it invaded Ukraine. Polish Deputy Energy Minister Irina Ziska told Politico in an interview that, quote, "I was observing thousands of attacks on our energy grid taking place live." Going on to say, quoting again, "We're extremely concerned about the cyber threats and cyber attacks in the energy sector in the European Union." In 2021, US energy pipeline operator Colonial Pipeline faced a ransomware attack that forced it to take down its systems and caused massive disruption to the country's energy supplies for weeks. The attack is believed to have been initiated by the Russian hacker group known as DarkSide, with the company forced to pay over $4 million in Bitcoin to get their systems back online. In 2012, according to Wired, a computer virus known as Shamoon wiped out data on 30,000 Saudi Aramco computers in what became one of the most devastating cyber attacks in history. It's commonly believed to have been perpetrated by Iran, which would make sense given all the other Iranian attacks on Saudi energy infrastructure. Overall, this kind of physical targeting of energy infrastructure is the bad cop to the good cop of energy coercive control. It has far-reaching effects that can be carried out by asymmetric means. After all, Finland and Estonia's $285 million Baltic Connector pipeline was bested by an anchor. Russian oil refineries are being targeted, costing the Kremlin millions through the use of cheap commercial drones. A $10,000 missile leaving a ship burning in the middle of the Red Sea with millions of dollars of oil in it is becoming increasingly common. In the future, states will have to look to ways to mitigate those attacks or face costly consequences for leaving their infrastructure so vulnerable. But how do you mitigate energy warfare? It seems so integral to conflict that it's impossible to avoid. And while that may be true, there are definitely ways to soften the blow. In order to counter energy warfare as effectively as possible, you need a multi-track solution. In the same way that depending on a single resource makes a state vulnerable, so does relying on a single kind of defense. How does a state protect itself, for example, against the coercive control kind of energy warfare? Well, there are multiple techniques and strategies that can severely limit another nation's energy coercion. One is easier said than done, and that's to have energy independence. If a country is not reliant on others for energy, it will not be vulnerable to nations that want to manipulate it. Iran's reserves of oil, and especially gas, make it largely energy independent. That relative independence allows them to face fewer consequences from the cacophony of sanctions that are levied against them on any given day. However, independence based around one source of energy alone isn't enough. States need multiple sources to function because different sources of energy have different uses. Nations must ideally build a diverse mix which, when combined together, ensure that a state's energy security cannot be easily compromised. Similarly, if a nation must import all of its energy, it should do so from multiple different places. That way, a fallout between two governments doesn't leave one scrambling to source energy imports. Another solution is to invest heavily in storage and battery infrastructure, meaning that a nation would have a backup supply in case of an emergency. However, this technology is currently limited and would only provide a stopgap solution. In terms of energy security, the current gold standard may well be nuclear power. Nuclear power stations can provide extraordinarily cheap electricity and even an opportunity to export excess electricity to other countries. It's no surprise then that with 56 operable reactors, France is the world's largest electricity exporter. It also suffered far less during Russia's gas cut-off of Europe than most of its neighbors, with inflation peaking at 5.2% in 2022. By contrast, inflation at 6.9% in Germany, 8.4% in Spain, and here in the Czech Republic, a wonderful 18%. Thank you so much. In short, France's ability to generate more nuclear power than it needs likely saved it from an economic crisis. Ukraine, which is currently at war with Russia, is another state that has made nuclear power work, with an agile enough energy network to shut down some plants and start up others depending on the situation. This could soon become extremely important, as President Zelensky has accused Russia of plotting attacks on Ukrainian nuclear plants. It's a good example of the risk that nuclear generation brings. It also demonstrates that nuclear power is not a magic bullet for infinite energy. Even with 15 reactors, blackouts across Ukraine are still common. And then there's the inherent risks to nuclear power that are much more dangerous than the ones a country takes when using fossil fuels. Nuclear power, if administered correctly, is a fascinatingly efficient thing, and it's extremely safe. However, the spectre of nuclear disaster from the rotting corpse of Chernobyl, which in the recent past briefly became an active war zone, has scared many countries away. There are also the associated costs and technological hurdles. Useful as it may be, nuclear power is clearly not suitable for everyone. Renewables are another way for a nation to diversify its energy streams. Almost all nations have access to wind, solar, and rivers for hydropower. Things like individual wind turbines or solar powers are hard to hit with conventional munitions, and because so many of them are currently required to generate electricity, taking out just one is not going to do it. Similarly, if you're conducting energy warfare, you can sap your opponent's ability to function by choking their supply of fossil fuels, but good luck trying to stop the wind or the sun. On the other hand, this tech has a long way to go, and the increased reliance on computers and integrated digital systems for renewables means that they may become increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks. It is clear, however, that countries need more than just things that will mitigate energy warfare risks. Simon Starn might enact all of these strategies and more, but one missile from the Kingdom of Whistlerelia to a pipeline, one cyber attack or act of sabotage could still weaken its energy security. So, how do nations go about defending from these kinetic means? Well, one solution is to spread everything out. It's much more expensive, but 10 small pipelines are much safer than one large one. Any military has to justify the use of kinetic force on a target. One missile to take out a country's entire supply of a resource is a no-brainer, but it's far less worth it the more spread out energy infrastructure is. Of course, some infrastructure can't be spread out. A nuclear power plant is a massive target, and everything to make it function has to be in the same place. This is where countries require their intelligence networks and defensive tech like anti-air systems and security services to cover the most important infrastructure. This comes at a cost, though. Every expensive air defense system a country uses to protect its valuable energy infrastructure is one less system to defend a city or another important target. So that's where energy warfare stands today. But there's still one last major question we still need to cover, and that's where will it go next? this point, it's impossible to say for sure where energy warfare will go next, although we can certainly try and make some educated guesses. Fossil fuels, for example, despite still being highly important to the world's functioning, are very slowly beginning to be phased out. As renewables continue to get more efficient, affordable, and see wider use, more nations will have a larger portion of their energy generated domestically, softening the potential for coercion other states will have over them. Energy warfare will always be a part of geopolitics and warfare. It's a key tactic for any military, and that isn't going to change even as technology does. It's highly important for nations to recognize the threats to energy security as asymmetric warfare takes over the geopolitical world. We don't operate in the world of sharp sticks anymore. When conducted effectively, energy warfare has the ability to totally cripple a country overnight. That's a lot of power for any nation to leave in the hands of its adversaries. It's up to nations to find the balance or fall over the edge. Thank you for watching.